This is the Future of the Future show. I am your host, Mateo Berbejicio. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most pressing challenges of our time: how to build artificial intelligence responsibly. My guest is Quentin Reul, a leader in AI ethics and governance and an active contributor to the IEEE Working Group on AI Ethics Oversight. Quentin has spent years helping organizations unlock the potential of data and AI while keeping responsibility, transparency, and trust at the core. In this conversation, we will unpack some of the most urgent headlines in generative AI, from models resorting to manipulation and unsafe outputs to the governance gaps that make these risks possible. Quentin will help us cut through the noise, explaining in plain language why these systems behave the way they do, what responsible AI means in practice, and how companies can start embedding ethical principles before and not after something goes wrong. We will also explore the debates shaping the future of AI, additive versus subtractive approaches to governance, the promise of hybrid neuro-symbolic systems, and the processes leaders often overlook in their rush to innovate. And finally, we will look ahead: what guardrails and cultural shifts will be needed to ensure AI remains not just powerful, but sustainable and trusted. So, whether you are an AI builder, a policymaker, or just someone trying to make sense of the headlines, this episode will give you both a framework and a forward-looking perspective. Quentin, thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you, Mateo, for having me coming to your show.
Very good. Let's get to it. Let's talk about some of the headlines. We recently seen headlines about Claude 4 resorting to blackmail, Grok generating racist and misogynistic content, and Meta's internal chatbot policy permitting highly inappropriate interactions with children. What's going on? When you see these stories, what do they reveal to you about the current state of generative AI?
Well, I think, firstly, they revealed that there is a lack of understanding of how these models are really working. If you look at Claude, for example, what was happening is when people were trying to terminate the conversation with Claude, it would resort to blackmail. And what I can see from the data, because what is really happening with these language models is that it leveraged the pattern that they see in data, in large amount of data, and then will predict what is the most likely word or token that would come afterwards. And my assumption is that given people, when they're being terminated, they would tend to send emails blackmailing their boss or something like that. And given that the data contained that pattern, then Claude, as it identified that kind of pattern in the interaction, leverage the same type of responses that is stored in these emails. It is not reasoning. Large language models, even those with reasoning method, cannot reason in the same way of human do. So it's not a cause and effect. It's not the cause of trying to terminate the LLM or stopping the conversation led to the blackmail. It's just an accident in some way. It's the same with Grok. What we see is Grok has been trained on X data. So the platform, they're using all of the data that people are tweeting as a way to retrain the model. We saw in 2016, if I remember correctly, when Microsoft created its first chatbot when it owned Twitter at the time. And what we saw the exact same pattern. So it's through the interaction that the bot, I think it was called Toe, was having with the users, it started going on and creating content that was misogynistic, racist in some in that form. So it's not new, and it's really garbage in, garbage out in that way. Whatever you provided as data to as an input is what you're going like to get as an output. Interestingly, as well with X, what we saw after Elon Musk bought the platform, we saw an increase by 10% on average weekly in the number of misogynistic and racist tweets that were coming after that. So it we can say that yes, it's not great, but at the end of the day, it's not surprising because of the underlying data that has been used to train these models. Now, you also mentioned Meta. I think that part is a slightly different problem. So with Grok and with Claude, the problem was really the training data. With Meta, there the problem is that the company actually wanted to have that particular behavior. And there they kind of created prompt that would tell the particular LLM how to behave. So if you like, it created a persona for the LLM saying, if you interact with people, I want you like to interact in a certain way. And it's given in the instructions. We saw exactly the same with Grok, to take that as an example as well, where it was trying like to create personas for the crazy conspiracy theorists or the unhinged comedian. And in that case, it's really like trying like to model or trying like to make the LLM behave in a certain way, which is really kind of wondering like to people, is this the right thing to do or not? But it's two slightly different problem that we're seeing appearing in the data. So one is really, what data is it trained on? And it's opaque, so nobody knows what it was used to train a lot of these models. I think like there are two models that I'm aware of that where the training data is really communicated is the Allen Institute Olmo model. And then more recently, the Swiss government created a model called Apertus, where they made everything available. But even the open source models like Meta, Gemma, we have no idea what data they are using or how they are pre-processing the data like to make it. So that is definitely causing a problem. And then the other part is making a persona that behave in a certain way, which may not be the ways that society wants it like to behave.
So at the end of the day, and this is for listeners with who are less familiar with the technical side, um, models are still predicting the next word based on training, based on probability, and that's what's leading them to become dangerous. Like you said, it's not that they are reasoning; it's not a cause and effect. It's just that based on the data that they had, the probability of the employee resorting to blackmail to not be shut off, they just okay, this is the way. Is that the issue? Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, look, let's take another example. If you ask an LLM, where is Paris? It's going like to tell you that it's in France. Most likely, because like a lot of the data is Paris is a capital of France, and you have a lot of data, a lot of people want to visit it. It's very unlikely that it's going like to give you Paris, Texas, which is another city. So it's really like an example of how like the data and the representation of the data, because it's probabilistic or statistical, the more occurrence of a relationship between two words is going like to be found in your training set, the more likely it's going like to be coming out as an answer. That's why when you use LLMs, they're very good at creating coherent text, but they're not very good at factuality because there is no knowledge that is behind it. It's just trying like to follow the pattern, the linguistic pattern that it learns from the data, and trying like to put a sentence that is going like to be together. And a lot of people call hallucination a bug. For me, I call it a feature. This is why the LLMs are different from the more traditional discriminative or neuro AIs or symbolic AI, sorry, is that they are really able to see new patterns in the data that was not predictable before. And if that creativity, which I think is a better term to hallucination, to generate things that have not been seen before or that have not necessarily have been seen before. Um,
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Now, given these risks, what does responsible AI look like in practice? How should businesses start embedding ethical principles into their AI strategies so they are not just reacting to crisis after the fact?
yeah, I think the first part of it, it's looking at whether generative AI is really the right solution to your problem. Um, I think the generative AI have really make it they've democratized AI for everyone. It's so easy to access AI. I've been in the field for 20 plus years, and creating data models or creating neuro models or even machine learning models was very expensive. You needed the label data and all of that kind of things before you could get started. But now with generative AI, you can get started very quickly. Although a recent study by the MIT showed that 95% of projects that were started with generative AI have actually not shown any return on investment. So I think that the first part is really looking at, why is this the right solution to my problem? A lot of, if you look at OpenAI, if you look at Anthropic, they have that vision of the artificial general intelligence. Um, but I don't think that that really is what business are looking for. Businesses generally have a very narrow problem that they want to solve for their customers, which means that leveraging these big models is not necessarily the best one. Um, Also, when you're looking at these, although some research is kind of pushing in terms of the transparency and in terms of the explainability of these models, but right now they are just black box. They are not only black box because you cannot trace how they got to the solution, but they're also black box, as I mentioned, because of the opaqueness of the training data that they're using. So you can use them, but then you have a risk that to your brand that it tells something like in the Grok example that is not something that you predict. This is where things like red teaming are playing a role, where you can uh, play an adversarial role in your application and try to make the LLM behave in a way that is not intended. I think this is where white hackers or people with that type of thinking can be very useful to help companies. Um, the other part of it like that is also important to keep in mind, especially if you're using closed models, is privacy and security. So what is happening to the data when you are passing it through these models? OpenAI is well known to keep track and logging all information that is processed, which is an impact for the enterprise. They say you can opt in or opt out for that information to be used for training, but my assumption is that the information is used for training regardless of it. Azure and Microsoft have taken a slightly different approach, and they've said, even though we're using the OpenAI models that we're deploying on Azure, we are not going to track any information that you have. I was more recently looking as well. I think Anthropic is trying to change as well their model to say it's no longer going to be an opt-in, opt-out, but we're going to use your data regardless because we want to do it. So I think that's another big responsible AI principle to take into account. And it's where a solution like Bedrock, or where you're deploying locally your LLM, may be better because you don't have any information going through, especially if you are processing data that could be under HIPAA, which is a rule in the US where personal health information cannot be processed and cannot be shared with other systems. I think like the other part that is also very important is replicability. And you have to understand that a lot of these neuro models are not replicable. So you may process a text with a prompt today, it's exactly the same parameters, and tomorrow you will have, or in an hour, you will have a completely different output from what it is happening before. And that is because every time it goes through different loops and sees the data slightly differently. So if you are doing things like categorization, you may have like one set of categories being identified on day one, and a few hours later, you will process the same text and you will have like different categories coming up. So it's how do you leverage that technology and understand? And I think it's not by AI literacy, to be honest. If you're not literate in the generative AI and how they work, you can't really adopt the right responsible AI principles to go forward.
So you are active in the IEEE working group on AI Ethics Oversight. What are some of the key ideas being discussed there, and why oversight and governance are as critical as technical innovation?
Well, I think, like with a lot of new technologies, there is always a gap between the existing legislation and what the technology can do. Um, and it really depends by geography. So in Europe, it's well known. You have like the EU AI Act that has been looking at this problem for quite a few years. They have a very nice framework of a pyramid. You have things that you can do, and then you have things that you cannot do, like social profiling and things like that. If you look at other countries, like in the US, we add some rules under the previous administration, and these have been taken apart. And it's a very complex system in as much as a lot of the different states are trying like to put in place their own legislation. But overall, there is no global oversight that has been created. There is no framework for global oversight. There are a number of framework that have been provided, but they're all voluntary. The OECD as a framework. The NIST has got like the risk assessment framework as well. But these are really voluntary. There is no protection around what people are doing. So what we're trying like to do from the IEEE perspective, it's providing that technical standard that would help company in behaving ethically by starting by defining what AI is, what are the problems, and what are the challenges that are unique to the different type of AI that are existing. In your introduction, you mentioned neuro-symbolic AI, and I would go further. There is neuro-symbolic, and there is also discriminative AI, which is a more traditional regression algorithm and things like that. So, how do we really look at the problem of AI from that perspective? There is also a gap from a societal perspective. Just last week, although I'm not sure that I fully trust the number, but the CEO from Salesforce mentioned that he was able like to reduce his workforce from 9,000 employees to just 5,000 employees by using just agents for anything that was supporting that type of things. I think it was misquoted personally, because like what it sounded like is that it would have been 9,000 people to do the same job that 5,000 people plus agents can do. Though I'm pretty sure that people lost their job as well. But I think there you have a perfect example of what people used to say are you're not going to lose your job to AI, but you're going like to lose to your job to someone that does AI. Well, this is a demonstration that actually job displacement is occurring, and that some companies, and especially in certain culture, like in the US, where profit is more important than anything else, are going like to leverage AI in that way, like to reduce their workforce. And ultimately, what does that mean? How do we find a way ethically to do that while retraining people, or finding new opportunities for them? It's not the first time that people have to change due to technology. The uh, Industrial Revolution in the 1900s or late 19th century was exactly the same. People were farmers, and now we had technology that pushes them like to do no longer be farmers. The internet did exactly the same, and reinvented ourselves. I think the biggest challenge that I see from that perspective is the speed at which some of these transformation were much slower than what we're seeing with generative AI. In the 3 years that generative AI and since ChatGPT, the evolution has been much faster than what we saw with the internet or with the industrial revolution. So that's the type of thing that we are trying like to look at. How do we put together a framework that will identify what are ethical aspect, and the good thing with the IEEE is that it includes people from across geography. So we have people from APAC or Australia, we have people like from China and Europe, and we have people from the US as well as Latin America. So it's very a diverse group of people with different thinking that are coming together and trying like to put this standard together.
When we talk about speed and speed of change, do you think, just based on the latest news about ChatGPT 5 and sort of the disappointment it has been for a lot of people, do you think it's slowing down? And if it is, do you think that's a bad thing or maybe a good thing? What are your thoughts?
I don't think it's slowing down in as much as every day you have a new announcement. I think what we're seeing, and especially with GPT-5, I think like there was a hype for a year since GPT-4 that it was going like to be transformative and everything. And in the end, it was more of a business plan of bringing together
Yeah,
all of the different models under one umbrella as
yeah.
opposed to have five different models. So it was more, I would say, an infrastructure cost benefit as opposed like to have this model that was revolutionary. Um, but I don't think that it's slowing down, because what we are seeing is, especially on the open source, is that you know, the gap is reducing, and the open models are reaching very quickly to the same type of quality as the closed models.
Okay.
Um, and we're also seeing that a lot of people are trying like to look at alternatives to how you're training and how you are working with these models. So if you look at 2022, the prompt engineer was a job. You
Yeah.
had people like spending hours and hours like to become like prompt engineers. Then we had fine tuning that came up, and a lot of people were spending that. In practice, we see less and less people doing really spending a lot of prompt. I found that um, I used to have like to write very complex prompt with this is your objective and all of that type of things. And now I go to Gemini Flash 2.5 and I just say, do this. And he's already got a notion of what I'm asking, so I don't have to give as much detail as what I needed before. So I think you may not see like the speed in such of the model per se, but the way that we are interacting with the model is definitely changing and becoming even more democratized for people, so that you don't need like to have that complexity. I was just reading a paper recently where instead of fine tuning, they were actually speaking about merging two models to try like to learn like the patterns and learning more from the domains as opposed like to going and use something that is much bigger.
That's very interesting. So one debate you have raised is around additive versus subtractive approaches to AI governance, starting small and fine-tuning versus starting big and applying guardrails. Can you walk us through the pros and cons of each approach?
Yeah, so I I like to think about it like from a human perspective. Um, when you're a child, you don't know much, and it's easy to learn new things. So as you go along, you are adding new pieces of knowledge. And generally, that piece of knowledge is not contradictory. So you build on your knowledge. You started with very small piece of knowledge, and now you're building on it, and you become more specialized. And especially if you are concentrating on something. So that's very much like that additive kind of model, if you like. But as you get older, and you have all of that information in your head, and you start seeing contradictory facts or new pieces of information that may be slightly different from your ethical perspective or your thinking, it becomes a lot harder to forget what was relevant. And that is kind of like your subtractive. So you're trying like to remove information. Two examples from history. One, when people discovered that the Earth was round as opposed to flat, people were not taking in it. You know. Similarly, when we discovered that the sun was not revolving around the Earth, but the Earth was revolving around the sun, people were just like, "Oh, we don't believe this." So I think that's kind of a representation of what these two approach are. In practice, I think it is much harder to control something that you may not know. So, we were speaking about like the blackmail and all of these things about not knowing what the data and the unpredictability of the model react doing something. And that is because there is a lot of data. So even if you use techniques like red teaming or others, or guardrails around a very large language model, that doesn't mean that you are going like to be able like to control it completely. Now, if you start with something small and you just add like necessary information that you need, so if you start with a small language model, what you will have as part of that is a grammar. It's how language is being used. But now you supplement that through fine-tuning and other method with the knowledge that is relevant to your industry, to your company. And now it's much easier to control because you know what you have used as part of that data. And you know that there won't be like any information about Paris. You know that you won't have any misogynistic behavior or racist behavior because the data doesn't contain that to start with.
That makes a lot of sense. So in a way, um, let me ask you this: which industries do you think will benefit more from the additive approach versus which ones can afford to use the subtractive method?
Uh, I would say like most industries would benefit from, and more enterprise would benefit from the additive approach. Um, Mostly because going back to what I said earlier, people are looking at narrow problems as opposed to the AGI solution. Um, there is also an infrastructure cost. It's much easier like to run smaller model than running large model. Like in terms of compute, you need less GPUs and that type of things. But in practice, definitely for regulated industries. I have this framework that I use is the cost to be wrong. And the idea of the cost of to be wrong is to assess what is the impact of the system making a wrong decision or giving you a wrong information based on which you're going to make a decision. So um, on the low spectrum, I use LLMs to write blogs. I use LLMs to generate images for my presentation and all of that. If I am wrong with my blog or if I'm wrong with my image, nobody gets impacted. Like the worst case scenario is people don't follow me anymore, people don't read my content, that type of things, or people don't like my presentation. Now, if you look at the other side of the spectrum, and let's say a doctor, and you are passing information from a clinical note about a patient, it's reading it, and it makes um, a recommendation as what diagnosis, what treatment should be given. Um, and in that case, like the doctor takes it and the patient die. Very high cost to be wrong. And one of the things, like with clinical note especially, is that doctors tend to write these notes in a way that is not grammatical. I don't know if you've ever seen like a clinical note. It's tend to be like just words and things. And in these, the word not is very important because that gives you information about patient history and all of that kind of things. And traditionally, we have seen that LLMs were not very good at understanding that negation when interpreting text. So in that case, not only like you have a high cost to be wrong, but you know that from their behavior, there is things that they will not interpret in the right way, which has got like an impact ultimately.
That's amazing. So let's go back. You mentioned something about this at the beginning. Hybrid or neuro-symbolic AI is a potential solution. What does that mean in practice, and how might it help reduce some of the risks we see in purely generative models?
Yeah, if you look at the history of AI, it started in 1956. I think like we just uh, we're close to the 70 years of that first summer research in Dartmouth. Um, and you had two chatbots that came up like around the 1960s, end of 60s, 70s, Mycin on the one end and Eliza on the other. And these were very much rule-based, which is what we call like the symbolic AI as approach or decision trees. It's things that are very predictable because you are saying if this or this and this, then do that. And they're very good for explainability. They're very good for replicability. The problem that you have with these is that when you're giving them new patterns, it's not able like to really respond in the right way. So if you ask Eliza, which was trying like to be a therapist as a chatbot, a question about what the weather is, it's going like to ask you like the question back, like what do you want? So this is not that great. Now you go like for the more traditional or discriminative AI models, like um, supervised learning or unsupervised learning, these start like to go a bit more with I can see new data and I can behave to that, but I'm still explainable. Um, and you have all of the training data and all of that kind of thing that kind of come in. Um, the problem with these is you have a problem of bias, um, but also of overfitting and underfitting, which is essentially that you have trained your model so specifically to a set of data that when it tries to apply to other data, it doesn't react in the right way. And that is because in the similar way that we were speaking about the generative model, it learns from the data. So in practice, what I've seen as an issue with these models is that people, and especially when we have labeled data, people tend like to put the generic patterns, so what they know is common, and then they add exceptions on top of it. And the exception is really what is causing the model to misbehave. Now, one of the limitations of symbolic AI, and especially rule-based, is that it's very expensive to maintain. You have to create a lot of rules. Well, now you take your generic pattern that you train through a regression model, you have like that generic pattern that is going to be learned and you can adapt. But then you use a rule-based system on top of that to deal with the exception. And now, instead of having 82, 85, 90% of precision recall, you can go to 100 because you have really separated what you could learn from to the exception. And then you have like the generative AI on top of that, which is more neural, which is more like a black box because the neural network is essentially you're passing information through different nodes, but the order in which the nodes are being called or the information is being processed is not replicable. It will change from one time to the other depending on how it segments the data. So even if you're using the same features, the same parameters, you train the model on the same data with a neural network, your output model is always going to be slightly different. It's going to be close, but you can't say that you're going like to always have the same results. But they're very good like when you know that you don't know what data you're going like to see. So it's very good at identifying these unknown patterns from the data. So it really like again go back to the AI literacy of the different type of models, but it also is really important like to focus on what is the problem that you're trying to address.
Right.
And then look at which technology is best fitted to really address that problem as opposed to like to look at it and come, yeah, I need generative AI because it's a new kid on the block.
Right. Right. So say if you were advising a company about to launch a new AI product, what risks would you ask them to map out first? And how should process and governance play into mitigating those risks?
Yeah, first of all, is really like, the data. What data are you going like to use? Do you know that data? Is it available? Is it in the right format? Well, actually, first I would say, what problem are you solving?
Right.
Then what data helps you solve that problem? Then what solution, again, like where's the cost to be wrong? What are my risks? Do I process data that is personal and identifiable information? Am I am I making a decision that will impact the life of someone? Or if I'm a banking system and I'm trying like to look at fraud detection, am I really identifying the right fraud? If I am in an educational, we have seen a lot of like school now adopting LLMs or AI to detect whether LLMs were used in assignments. Um, Interestingly, I was reading an article saying that the closer people, like the more people are using generated content and training it and making it available online, the more difficult it's going to be for these new models to detect the
Right.
reality from what was written manually or not.
Right.
But but I think that that's really like what is going like to impact the customer's trust in your company, or what is going like to impact potentially your brand and your reputation. And that's really like where you start from the risk. And what are the risk of making the wrong decision, the cost to be wrong, and what impact then can that have, and regulation. Do I know the regulation in the place that I'm operating? And do I have a risk of not um, going with the regulation and comply with it in the right way?
So why do you think process is overlooked many times in the rush to innovate? And if you think so, why? And then, how can leaders strike a balance between innovating? Because the everyone is pushing, right? I mean, if you are now a CEO of a company, it's like if you're not using AI in some way or another, you, you think you're doing something wrong, right? So how can leaders strike a balance between agility and responsibility?
Um, I think like the MIT report like kind of covers it like in the right way is to what you're saying, like a lot of people are retrofitting technology to find a problem that can be solved by the technology, as
Yep.
opposed to look at what problem do we have or what problem does our customer have that can leverage technology to solve it. So I always kind of like go back to there is this framework, the jobs to be done.
Yep.
Um, and go back from that perspective of what am I trying to achieve for my customers, and how do I package that in a way that then I have defined my KPIs, my metrics that I can evaluate my solution very quickly, so that I can determine that I'm getting the right return on investment if that's what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for more of a staff augmentation or efficiency, am I getting the right efficiency? Are people really getting like the what they want and what they need from the system that is being created? But I've seen so many times, and when I was doing work at a company where we were trying like, to innovate,
Mm.
is that we were really looking holistically at the problem and then applying solution to it, but we didn't necessarily assess whether there was a gap that people were willing to pay for.
Right.
And ultimately, that's, what can be perceived from the outside as a problem may not necessarily be a problem because people have processes and they've found other ways to be efficient than trying like to retrain them using a new system like an AI-based system may be more expensive ultimately than just keeping like the status quo.
Makes sense. Um, Kantan, one last question to you. Looking ahead, do you feel optimistic about our ability to build AI responsibly? Or what do you see are the most important guardrails or cultural shifts needed for AI to be sustainable and trusted?
So I am optimistic, um, but I am also conscious that with new technology becomes bigger responsibility
Right.
to just quote Spider-Man there. Um, but I think the problem is not technology. Like I've used like the analogy to guns in the past, where the gun is not the the thing killing people. It
Yeah.
is how people are using the gun that causes people to be killed. The same is here with AI. Um, you can ethically and responsibly use AI for the good. The problem with technology, and we see this in cybersecurity, where people are using it as attacks. We see it with fraud and people leveraging text to speech to try like to defraud people. So I think there it's what as a society do we feel is the right guardrails, and how do we learn from what we've put in place elsewhere? The problem it's it's very much geographical. I use like the example of the gun. In the US, it's very unlikely that you are going to have any regulation around guns.
Yeah.
Same with AI, like in the way that it's going now. Whereas in Europe, you have very strict regulation around it. So I think it's how do we as a society are willing like to leverage this technology for the good, but it's also important for everyone to understand the risk. And to me, like that's where like the AI literacy is really important, so that when you use the systems, you know what are the risk of using them to start with, and that you just don't get, howled by the shiny new object, which I think a lot of companies are doing, and leading like to them not being as successful as they want to with leveraging generative AI.
Makes a lot of sense. Kantan, thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. So much insight, so much great advice. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, for spending time here with me at the show. I appreciate it, and I hope that we can stay in touch and we get to do this again in the future sometime.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mateo. That it was great.